this. Oh, here we go.
I actually have a better story about my name that I forgot to mention. Yeah.
Tell us in a second.
Okay, we can go ahead.
Oh Brother, Not Another Podcast is a co-production of Verso Studios and the incredible new Westport Library. I'm Trace Burroughs.
And I'm Miggs Burroughs. And spoiler alert for anyone who gets Edible Nutmeg magazine, our guest today is Rachel Precious, one of the heroines of Connecticut cuisine. And she is the, I guess you're proprietor of Precious Oysters.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
What is it, Tied to Table?
Tied to Table Shucking Service. Right.
Shucking Service.
Mm-hmm.
How do you promote? How do people hear about you? You're the service.
It's just been word of mouth so far. I had I'm about just over 1 year in business, so going into my second summer, and it's just been word of mouth. Social media, of course, has been a great help, but also I work full time for Cops Island Oysters in Norwalk, so. That's actually where most of my gigs come in. In the beginning, most of them were coming from people would call up the shop and they say, "Oh, I love your oysters. I want to have them at my party, but I just can't shuck them, or I don't want to shuck, 100 plus oysters." And so I actually have a background in event production. And so then I took that experience, and when I started working at the farm and hearing all these phone calls coming in, I thought, well, I know how to throw a party. I know how to be a server and talk to people, but I also know how to shuck an oyster, and I can talk about the oysters. I'm not just serving them. I'm talking to people about how they grow, where they grow, the flavor profiles, everything like that. So people would call up and they'd be looking for a shucker, and the company used to say, maybe we can send somebody over. I don't know. But then I started being like, me, I'm here. Send me. And so I was doing events for Cops Island for a little while, and then just started doing my own. I made my own brand and my own company.
Do you have to stay like a party? They hire you. Do you have to be there from start to the end of the party?
No, it's usually about a 2-hour gig.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, most of them are things like small dinner party. Well, I've done everything from a small dinner party of 8 people up to last summer I did a beer festival with 3,000 people.
Wow.
Yeah, and everything in between. So weddings, some corporate events, but most of them are about 2 hours. People, they get all excited and they see the raw bar, they come over, they have a few, and then they kind of make their way to the rest of the food, and that's it. So it's pretty good. It's just with setup and breakdown all together, it's maybe like a 3-hour gig.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. So it works well with my current schedule of being full-time at the farm. So I'm there like 7 a.m. to maybe 5. And in summertime, it's full on. And then evenings and weekends, I can go do my little gigs.
Do you do other farms then? Just the farmer's market? Or you mean the oyster farm you're working full-time?
Yeah. So I'm full-time at Cops Island.
Yeah.
So usually Monday through Saturday.
And it's mostly out on the ship?
Yeah. So my main,
farming?
I do a lot of different things there. I actually started in the industry in 2016, and I was going out, and this was with a different company in Stamford. And I'd go out on the boats with the guys every day with big rubber overalls and actually harvest all the oysters. And I loved it. It was really intense. It was like 60 hours a week, any kind of weather, rain, snow, anything. But nowadays, so now I'm with Cops Island, and I mostly run the nursery. So I grow the little babies from the time they're like a speck of sand to about an inch. And then once they get to be that big, we put them out in the open water. I'm kind of the oyster mama.
How do pearls get into oysters? I just thought
It's a good question. Yeah. So essentially a pearl is just a little irritant that gets inside the oyster when it's filter feeding. So the shell opens up a little bit and sucks in water, and sometimes other things like little bits of plastic or sand or just little irritants.
So the babies, let's call them baby oysters that you raise, do they ever end up with pearls in them?
Sometimes, actually, funny story. So on average, I shuck maybe, in the slow season, I'll shuck me like 200 oysters a week. Busy season, summertime, with when I'm doing like 3 or 4 events a week, I'm shucking close to maybe 1,000 oysters a week. And I've never found a pearl. But at the farmer's market in New Canaan last year, somebody bought a dozen oysters, came back the next week and said, "Oh, I found a pearl in one of your," and I thought, what? How is that fair?
Yeah.
I don't understand. Give it back. That's mine, actually. So I've never found one. But yeah, it's a little irritant that gets inside the oyster, and the oyster produces this calcium carbonate sort of material that it makes its shell with. But so it starts to coat that little irritant in that same material, the shell material, and just keeps coating it to make it like a nice, soft, round shape.
So the pearls in a pearl necklace, are they really directly from oysters, or are they shaped or polished, or are they just right
depends.
out of
the the ones I'm wearing right now, they'd be from a pearl farm. So they're very cultured.
Right.
Like they take a small piece of plastic, it's a little plastic bead, and they'll insert it inside the oyster, and they monitor them. Yeah,
because
exactly.
I've seen the mutant ones. I don't know what they call.
Yeah,
those.
well, that would be a natural pearl.
Yeah.
Yeah. and they can be all weird,
That's
wonky
right.
shapes.
Yeah.
So if you were, what's the way to find out more about oysters? Pretend you're an oyster. Here we're interviewing Rachel the oyster. What's your life like? How long is your life? How tiny are you when you're born, and where do you?
Yeah.
Yeah, and what do you
So-
eat? What's your diet? And
When a mama oyster loves a daddy oyster.
Oh, we're having that talk.
Yeah, I know we just met, but it's a pretty interesting life cycle. But,
Yeah.
so when the water gets to be I think it's about 78 degrees, it'll trigger the adult oysters to spawn. And actually, oysters are hermaphroditic or hermaphrodites. So if there are a bunch of male oysters releasing sperm in the water, the other oysters are like, well, there's a lot of sperm here, so let's become female oysters and put out eggs. It's kind of crazy.
So they can go either
do
way.
they have to
Either
be
way.
close? Do they have to touch?
They're kind of like ACDC.
Yeah, well,
Right.
Sorry.
So they'll release the eggs and sperm in the water. They don't have to be next
Yeah.
to each other, but they
Yeah.
just
It
kind of
just-
all mixes in the water column. And so once the egg is fertilized, it just takes, within a couple hours, I believe, a little tiny larvae forms. And it looks just like an adult oyster, but it's microscopic. And they actually have what's called a foot, which is kind of more like a fin, to be honest, but it's called a foot. And that the baby oyster will swim around for about 2 to 3 weeks, and it's looking for a hard substrate to attach to. So either rocks, pieces of driftwood, but ideally other oyster shells. So that's why in our business, in the oyster industry, it's very important to return oyster shells to the water and make sure that we have, because if you put an old shell back in the water, all the larvae will attach to that. And once they attach to it, that's where they live forever. Yeah. And so we do a oyster shell recycling program at Cops Island. And actually a lot of other oyster farms do that. So they ask their restaurants to return the oysters in a bucket. I know there's a group in the city that goes around and collects the oysters. And yeah, we put the shells back in the beds, and the whole cycle starts all over again.
now what makes my son who lives in Boston was eating at a restaurant, told me this a few months ago, and he ordered oysters, and he said, "These are the best oysters I've ever had. Where do these come from?" And the waiter went back and came back and said, "They come from Westport, Connecticut."
Nice.
So what makes Westport oysters special, and how far do you, as an oyster, travel? I mean, how far do you get around?
Yeah, so technically any oyster found on the East Coast that grows on the East Coast is the same species. It's called Crassostrea virginica. And so, but where they're grown and how they're grown, it's kind of like wine grapes. We call it the terroir. Like wine has terroir, we've got terroir. So even though they're the same species, an oyster from Maine will taste totally different than an oyster from Florida. And even within Connecticut, if you've got an oyster that grows up in Mystic, where it's at the mouth of the Long Island Sound, that'll be a lot saltier than one down in Greenwich. And it also depends where the oysters are grown, if they're grown on like a muddy substrate or more of a rocky substrate. How the water flows dictates what kind of food they're getting. So yeah, so Westport, Norwalk, like the island chain we have out here on Kokini, that's just a prime area for growing oysters, just based on, like I was saying, the way the water flows, the substrate, the ecosystems out there. Yeah.
And they've cleaned up the water. How's that now?
Yeah, it's kind of a sensitive, not a sensitive topic, but when people say, "Oh, oysters are good for cleaning up pollution," they'll then often say, "Oh, but I don't want to eat them because they're now full of pollution." So what it technically is, the oysters, they're not eating things like, they're not consuming, say, oil runoff or heavy metals or things like that. They're consuming things like excess nitrogen and what would cause like an algae bloom, for example. So they're good for controlling, like I was saying, excess algae, but they're not going to be sucking up toxic chemicals that you'll then eat. And if they do absorb or consume things like when it rains, you have to be very careful not to harvest anything after, I believe it's an inch. If you get an inch and a half of rain within 24 hours, we're not allowed to harvest any oysters for up to a week. Any of the oysters that we grow close to land because of runoff. So yeah, things like lawn fertilizers, geese poo, stuff like that, all goes into water. But the oysters will naturally cleanse themselves after a couple days. So after 7 days, we can guarantee that they're safe to eat.
So, like, when you harvest your oysters and you set up the bed you're talking about, so you have to go back to the beds. Can you go off and say, well, I'm going to try a mile out there?
Yeah, that's how we do it. So Cops Island is a very large company. They have a lot of different beds. Some of the beds are very close to land, and we can grow them there, but we can't necessarily harvest from those beds. So, for example, the beds that are close to shore might have better nutrients for the baby oysters. They'll grow quickly, but then we have to move them out to for waters that are further away. so they can cleanse and they can depurate. So after they spend a certain amount of time further away from land, they're safe to eat.
So does Cobb's have to like rent the water area?
So they lease. They either
lease.
own or lease. What it technically is, you can't own the ocean floor. You can't own ocean space, but you can own the right to farm in that area. So, or you can lease the right. What's that?
You have to go to the state to...
The state or the town. It depends. Every area is different. But I know, for example, like I think Jeff Northup in the Mill Pond.
I went to school with him. Yeah, I was going to bring him up later. Yeah.
So he's got a pretty interesting growing area. I don't know the full story, but for example, he has the right to grow and farm oysters there. Mm-hmm.
So what is from seed to harvest or whatever, what is the time span?
It depends. Up around here, it'd be about 2.5 years. If you go to areas that are warmer, like in Florida, they grow, because in the wintertime, oysters stop growing. So the peak growing season is from about April through September. After that, the growth slows down. They start to, they actually get ready to hibernate, so they're eating a lot. And actually, wintertime is the best time to eat oysters. Not necessarily because of that rule, the months with R. Have you heard about that?
No.
So people say, it's only safe to eat oysters months that have the letter R, September, October, November. So that's from back in the day when people didn't have proper icing techniques and temperature control procedures. So there's a certain kind of bacteria that's in all seafood. But if the seafood is kept below a certain temperature, that bacteria is almost non-existent. It's fine. It's safe. But if the seafood gets to be above a certain temperature, that bacteria grows like crazy. And it can make you very sick. So in the winter, it would be cold, so you knew it was safe to eat. But also in the summertime is when oysters spawn. So they're using all their energy to produce the eggs and the sperm. And the meat's just thinner, it's a little more translucent. So winter is definitely the safest time of year to eat them, but they also just taste the best. And they're really fat and juicy.
In the winter. So, but they're hibernating, right?
Meaning they're not growing, but they're still feeding a little bit. They're still alive. But for example, my job with the nursery stuff is very calm in the winter because they're not really doing anything.
So when you're at an event and you're shuck, is that oyster, is that a living thing until you shuck it? Until you open it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right.
But technically, oysters don't have a brain and no central nervous system.
I beg your pardon.
Just like us.
Yeah. Right.
We didn't know we had so much in common.
You learned something, right? So you don't need to feel guilty about eating a live animal. It's actually a conversation I like to have with vegans is, I kind of call them meat plants because they're they have a nervous system that will respond to stimuli just in the same way that a Venus flytrap will. Right. If you touch it, it closes up, right?
Reflex, yeah.
But they don't have any central nervous system. Like I said, no brain. So as far as we know, there's no way for them to process pain, at least in the same way that humans and mammals and other living things process pain. So it's like, what's the difference between a plant and an oyster?
So they're
or a
not
clam?
going, oh my God, here comes Rachel.
Right. I mean, they will clam up.
or oyster up.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And what about the nutrients? What does it? There's all sorts of legends about oysters and their their nutrients. What do they have? What did you know? What their
they're really high in
breakdown
iron.
is? Yeah.
Yeah. I believe what was it? Clams, I think, are one of the top sources of iron. More than meat, more than a lot of leafy greens. Okay. Mm-hmm. They're very low in calories, very low in sugars, obviously. They're all around a really great thing to eat.
Now, would a purist put, people put the cocktail sauce or put this, should they just be eaten plain? Is that
I always kind of laugh. People come up to me at events and they say, oh, I love oysters. They're so excited. And they grab one and then they dump all the juice out, all the liquor. And I'm like, oh, okay. All right, I see where this is going. And they take a big scoop of the cocktail sauce. And I'm like, what? You could just ask me for a bowl and a spoon for the cocktail sauce.
Right.
Save the oysters for somebody else.
Just a vehicle for the other stuff.
But if you meet a real oyster enthusiast, they like to have them just straight up plain. Maybe a drop of lemon juice. I personally like mignonette sauce, which is everyone's got their own recipe, but it's basically a red wine vinegar, shallots, and cracked pepper kind of concoction. But I add honey to mine. It kind of takes the edge off.
People with Tabasco sauce.
Some people use Tabasco sauce, but for a mignonette, you wouldn't. I know the Welk does a jalapeno kind of blend. It's really good. Yeah, sweet and a little bit of spicy.
So a little bit about your background and what you've done, before you got into the oysters.
What haven't I done? My gosh.
What haven't you done? What is ningbing?
Oh, the ningbing. Oh, that's my favorite. So the ningbing is the world's smallest marsupial. So, marsupials are mammals that have a pouch.
Yeah.
So the ningbing looks just like a little mouse. It's tiny.
Yeah.
It has a little pouch. It's really cute. And they're native to only a very specific area in Australia. And so I was part of a research project that was, we were looking at the ningbing, but in order, like its territory and what,
cute name.
yeah, isn't it great? But in order to study that, we had to study the entire ecosystem. So like what's preying on them, what are their food sources, things like that. So I got very close and personal with things like the king brown snake, scorpions.
Oh,
lots
those
of
are
toads.
deadly, right?
They're very
Yeah,
deadly, yeah.
yeah.
But the thing is, the king brown snake looks almost identical to the regular brown snake they have over there. The only way to tell the difference is by looking at the scales in the stomach. So you see it on the ground, you're like, well, I'm just going to be afraid. I'm just going to, like, by default, I'm just going to be afraid.
So you're just studying them, like, scientifically.
Yeah, this is for the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. I was just doing, so my degree is in conservation biology, but that was all terrestrial-based studies. So when I graduated college, I wanted to get out in the world and see, I had so many interests, didn't know what I wanted to do. So I figured I would just do different volunteer things. So I did, one of them was this research project in Australia.
Miggs, did you know that Rachel made large-scale puppets at one point in
Oh,
her...
yeah, I did.
No.
Also in
We're doing
Australia.
different research platforms here. No, I had no idea. Really?
Well, so for
Go
that,
ahead.
by day I was studying humpback whales, and by night I was making and performing in giant puppet costumes.
Oh, you were in the costume.
Yeah. So
For
I'd
what?
get
These are the...
with the pulleys and
Yeah.
the sticks and.
Is this
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
performance troupe or something?
Yeah. So I worked
Oh.
with a woman, and she used to work with this puppet troupe. It's world renowned. They would travel all over the world, China, all over the U.S. in these giant costumes. I'm talking like as tall as the ceiling here, and they would do these performances all over the world. So I worked with a woman who used to be with them, and she did performances in particular. Using local indigenous species. And so we would make like a giant finch costume or a giant lizard costume because those species were native to this part of Australia. Then we would go and we would do festivals. We would go to really remote areas and communities that didn't have access to education and to learn about their own world. So I would go in dressed as a giant canary and dance around. The kids would be like, oh my gosh, what is this?
So you'd buy the materials and construct the...
Yeah, we would use
big puppet
bamboo
thing.
and different materials to lash together like the frame of the costume and then wear it.
Was it a one person? Because, in Chinatown, they do the dragons, and there's 20 people in the dragon.
This is one
right?
person, yeah.
Yeah, one person thing.
Or, well, it would be one person in the costume, and then each person had
Oh.
a guide with them. Which is funny because the first performance I did, you have a little piece of mesh somewhere so that you can see through, that you can see what you're doing. But we didn't really take into consideration the layout. So the first performance we did, the lights, it was outside. And there's a bunch of bonfires and people sitting around everywhere. And there were these big lights on us, and the lights actually just kind of blinded us. We couldn't see through our mesh. It was just very poorly planned. So I was essentially blind, and I had to rely on my guide 100%. She'd be like, okay, 2 steps front. Now step up your foot. There's a flaming log. There's a small child. Step to the left. And it was such an amazing exercise in just listening and trusting the
Sure.
person I was with.
Now, we noticed when we came in here, you had a small bag, and I'm presuming you brought us
Yeah.
ham sandwiches.
I ate that on the way. But I did bring some oysters if you wanted to
that'd be
learn
wonderful.
a little.
Yeah.
Yeah, did you get a shuck?
tricks and tips.
I haven't had oysters in so long.
Oh, my
I got some
gosh.
weird fear of shellfish. I have no reason to be because I love oysters.
You do, because like I said, if they're not handled properly, if they're not kept at the right temperature, you can get really sick. So
Yeah.
I'm really diligent about. Even my friends are like, "Oh, I don't need to have ice in that bag." I'm like, "Yes, you do."
Yeah.
So I'm very diligent about following the rules because I don't want to
Thank
be.
you.
Yeah. So I have my little shucking bag. I bring to all my
the-
events. It's a very thick material, and I've got all my knives inside. And there's a lot of different kinds of knives, different styles. Some of them are curved, a little curve like that. Some have a round handle at the back. Some are flat, like this one here. If I'm going to shuck, 500 oysters in 2 hours, I need to have a round handle because this, I learned the hard way, this flat back will give you a nice blister right
Okay.
in the
And you wear
middle.
gloves, though, right?
I
You
always
gotta
wear gloves, yeah. But you actually wear the glove. So I'm right-handed, so I hold the oyster in my left hand, and the left hand is where you wear the glove, because that's where the knife will go if you miss. Yeah. So I always tell people the colder the oysters are, the easier they are to open. But you don't want to freeze them, but maybe put them in the freezer for like 5 minutes or so, or just keep them on ice. And then I have my little cloth. So if you don't have a glove, you can always use a nice thick kitchen cloth. You just want to protect your hand in some way because either the knife could just slip or sometimes the shell will break.
I always found, I've shucked a clam, but they're more obvious, the edge, where
Yeah.
oysters have that rough riff,
Yeah.
Right. The crevice.
So a clam
frilly
knife-
edges or whatever it is. I don't know what the word adjective
Scalloped
is.
edges.
Yeah. So like, how do you find the opening with those things?
Well, so everyone's got their own way of doing
Yeah.
it. But just to show you real quick, so a clam knife is only sharp on one edge. So you wouldn't want to use an oyster knife for a clam. But like I was saying, the oyster knives can be curved. I like a straight blade.
So could it be if you're doing it at home when you don't have the special? Could you use a paring knife or something like that?
They're usually not strong enough.
Oh.
Yeah. So I would say if you don't have an oyster knife, you can always use a flathead screwdriver. But it's going to be a little more difficult. But you just want something really strong with a bit of a point on it. So I've got my, let me see, where's my, I've got my oyster knife. Here's my clam knife, glove, cloth, and then you're pretty much good to go. So here's this guy. So the cup side, this nice rounded cup, that's actually the bottom shell. So in the wild, see that little flat part right there? That's where it would be attached to either a rock or another oyster or something. So that's going to be the side facing down. And when you're just starting out, you can use a table. I actually just shuck in my hand, though I find it easier. If you're using a table, you want to use your left hand, the hand that's going to be holding the oyster, just to kind of keep the oyster in place. You're not going to be pressing down on the oyster, but just hold it steady. And then with your right hand, your shucking hand, you take your knife, and it's called the hinge. It's where the shell comes together at the back in kind of a point. And so you put your knife in there in the hinge. And again, just keeping it steady with this hand. You're going to put the knife in the hinge and just sort of wiggle
like a
it.
45 I'm just, since nobody
Yeah,
can
you
see
wanna
this,
go-
sort of like a
right.
45-degree angle maybe?
You want to go with the shape of the shell.
Yeah.
So not directly down and not totally to the side, but just going with the curve of the shell. So you put your knife in there, and you're going to kind of just gently apply a little bit of pressure, but just kind of wiggle the knife up and down. And you can also turn it side to side like a key almost. And you'll see it just sort of pops.
yeah.
It pops just like that. So when it pops, take your knife out. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm just, the only time with clams, too, there was always a muscle you had to like.
Yep, that's the next step.
Okay, there is, that has it, too? Okay,
Yeah, and so even though the oysters are very well washed before you get them, there's some stuff will get in that the hinge back there. So when you pop it like that, pull your knife out and just wipe your knife off so you don't get any of this mud inside. So then put the knife back in that hinge that now it should be nice and loose. See that?
Yeah.
And just kind of wiggle the knife, again, turning it side to side like a key almost. And then you're going to take the knife and drag it along the inside of the top shell, and you'll hit that muscle.
Oh, okay. They have the
So you're going to
same-
sever that muscle. You're going to drag it really close along the inside of that shell and sever the muscle. So I got a little bit of mud inside, which is not harmful. You can just kind of dump it out like that.
Now, can you tell by color that there's a healthy oyster? Not that it wouldn't be, but
You would know, yeah. If
you
it's,
would
if the
know.
oyster's not good to eat, it'll be dry, first of all.
Oh, okay.
Very dry.
So it wouldn't have the-
Yeah. So technically, oysters can live for months out of the water as long as they're
Oh,
kept
really?
cold.
Oh.
If they're cold and dry, they'll live for months. But after about a week, they're circulating the same water inside their shell, so they're just not very fresh. So we always tell people a week tops, and then put them back in the water. So you cut off the top shell. Yeah, well, that's the great thing is they don't go in the garbage. They
That's
don't go to
right,
waste.
yeah.
Throw them back in the water where they came from. So what I do at events, whatever's not used, I bring back to the farm, and it goes back in the water. So
Oh.
there's zero waste.
What's the lifespan of
great.
an oyster?
Oh, years and years. They'll live.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
I don't know the oldest oyster, but unless they get eaten or they get a disease, they'll just keep going.
Yeah.
So the muscle is still attached underneath the meat as well. So you can see also these on one side of the oyster are these little frills. These are called the gills of the oyster, and they're just little layers almost. And that's where the food, the algae, and all that comes in. The oyster picks out what it wants, and it spits out all the water and the stuff it doesn't want. So underneath this, you can see right here, there's kind of a lump, a big sturdy mass. That's the muscle we just cut, and it's still attached underneath.
Okay.
So drag your knife. Actually, turn the shell around. Drag the knife underneath that muscle right there.
You're kind of scooping it out. Just getting
Yeah.
Yep, just dragging the knife. And then just test it. Just move the meat around and make sure that it's nice and loose. And then it's good to go.
Now the liquid did you call it the liquor? Or
The liquor.
Oh, yeah, okay. So there's nutrients, and you don't, like you said, you're not supposed to dump it out because that's where
Right.
the good stuff.
Although sometimes, like I did get a little bit
little
of mud
grit.
in there. So what I would do is I would just dump out a little bit of it. See, like that? Because what happens is it will, as it sits here for a minute, it will still excrete some more juice or liquor. So I haven't, even though it looks like I'm totally dumping it all out, I'm like, oh
Yeah.
no, I'm losing it. It will still, after a minute, make a little bit more. And sometimes you get a little shell in there, so make sure you just pick it out. Nobody wants to crunch their oysters. So, anybody want to try?
Oh, yeah, I will. I haven't had
Yeah?
one like in years.
Oh my gosh, here you
I'll
go.
make one.
Yeah.
Wait.
I have plenty, so.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. And the technique is, should I just
Slurp
dump
it.
it into my mouth, slurp it into
Slurp it
the
in
whole
and
thing?
give it a couple chews. Some people just suck it right down. I'm like, again, why are you even?
Oh, yeah, because you want to get the essence.
I mean, I love briny, salty things anyway.
Yeah,
So,
Yeah.
same here.
So that was harvested about, what time is it now? It's like 3 or
and
something.
after 3.
These came in around 1 or 2.
So they'll never be that fresh in a restaurant. Well, yeah, so we'll get into that one. I'm just curious how a restaurant, you go to a restaurant in Boston, the oysters came from Westport. How old would they be?
By the time they get to your plate, maybe 2 days.
Oh,
So
okay.
they'll be shipped out. Let me see. Oysters harvested today will go out around 3 o'clock tomorrow morning up to Boston. Be in the restaurants by noon maybe, and then on your plate that evening.
Yeah, okay.
So really
There's
fresh.
no loss of.
Right.
Yeah, no, I love it. It's such a delicate.
So here we go. I've got another oyster going here. And again, I've cut that top. Ooh, we got lucky. We found a
One.
pea crab. Do you know what a pea crab is?
No. What's
So these little guys are really common. I'd say 1 out of every 5 or 6 oysters in the summertime. They're less common in the winter. It's a little tiny orange alien-looking critter.
It's a face grabber. It's gonna.
You know, they say
I'm the
it's
lucky
good
one
luck.
who's going to
Lock
be eating
onto
this
your
thing in a
face.
second.
Now, when you eat it, don't mind the screaming. It, just,
Okay.
it is considered a delicacy.
Don't mind his screaming.
Yeah, but
They say it's good luck. Do you need some luck right now?
Oh,
Super Bowl
you
Sunday.
never-
So, I personally
Wow.
don't like to eat them, but yeah.
But
So
they are
they
edible. Okay, well,
Right.
it's up to you. I would pass.
So when they're babies, they get in the oyster. When the oyster is eating, it opens up a little bit, so the crab as a baby will get in there, and it doesn't hurt the oyster. It just lives in between the gills I was showing you, and it just hangs out and kind of filter feeds as the oyster feeds.
Okay.
You wanna eat
that's
'em,
good.
or I can
No,
put 'em-
I'm ready. I'll do it.
Yeah, you're gonna do it.
What, you're gonna do the crab?
No, you said I could eat the
Do you want it?
Yeah,
I'm
pea
saying
crab.
a lot of people do, but some people are
As long as
squeamish.
it's okay
Yeah.
to eat, I'll eat it.
Okay.
Because, like I tell people at my parties, it's either your belly or the bucket.
Yeah.
Because I bring a
once you've
bucket with.
opened- Oh, okay.
Once you open the oyster, it won't survive. So
No.
if you don't put
there's
it out
no-
of its misery, it's
You can't put it back in the.
there you are.
Do you ever get other anomalies like twin? You open it up and there's twins. Are oysters ever twins?
No,
No, there's
I
no.
haven't tried
You
that
never
with
get
that yet.
too weird. What's the
weirdest
weirdest?
is just the crab.
crab.
How was that?
Delicious.
Fresh,
Mm,
local.
phenomenal.
So these are harvested,
So-
even though Cops Island is based in Norwalk. So that's where the farm is based, but they have grounds all up and down the coast. So they have grounds from Greenwich up to Mystic, and these specifically came from Westport today.
Oh, great. So
Harvested.
before we have like a minute left, and
Yeah.
you're welcome to keep, but we're just let people know where they can find you for events, and so where should they reach you?
Yeah, so preciousoysters.com. You can see pictures of my work, but also learn a bit about the oysters and why I do what I do, my backstory. I'm on Instagram, Precious Oysters, and you can always just stop into Cops Island. We've got a retail shop.
Is that in
down there.
Norwalk?
It's in East Norwalk.
Yeah.
It's right near, there's like Partners Cafe and Overton's and
Right, I know
Mr.
it.
Frosty's Ice Cream.
Yeah, I've been to an event. I think Earth Place has an event there.
Yeah,
every
yeah.
year. Yeah, I go to, and they obviously have the whole. you
Yeah.
know, clams and
And people
oysters,
come down,
yeah.
I can show them baby oysters. You
Oh.
see the boats coming in, and it's a great way to learn about what's right here in your backyard. A lot of people don't know we're back there. You know?
So it's yeah. Obviously, there's a lot of hard work that goes into this. A lot of sweat equity or whatever into just
Right.
producing this delicate, tasty morsel from the sea,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I mean, I could talk about these all day.
Well, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for
It was
having
really
me.
interesting.
Yeah.
Phenomenal. So go find
Yeah.
Precious Oysters.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll see you.